Sir Malcolm Rifkind, welcome to Face to Face.
Thank you.
Let's begin today by talking about the Chilcot inquiry into the reasons that the British government gave for taking Britain into Iraq in the first place. Now, you called for it to be a public inquiry because it was going to be closed before, yes. And you asked the Foreign Secretary David Miliband, you demanded that whatever conclusions were drawn, if they were critical, they should be critical. Is it enough that we've had an inquiry?
Well, I think this is a very unique set of circumstances. I mean, going to war is always something very special and very difficult and very dangerous, but you don't automatically expect an inquiry thereafter. But this particular war was hugely divisive within the United Kingdom, not just in the wider world. There has continued to be a deep belief that the legality of the war was suspect, not only because of the absence of a specific resolution from the Security Council, but also because of some of the information that was given to Parliament, which turned out, whether in good faith or in bad faith, to have been incorrect and therefore opened up other fundamental questions. So you have to have a way of resolving these issues. There's not a perfect solution, but I think this inquiry, because its remit is so broad and because it is open and available, if it so wishes, to criticise those who were involved, that is, I think, the best step that could have been taken at this moment in time.
I understand that you were very cautious about committing our troops, about the government committing troops to Iraq in the first place.
I thought the war was a mistake.
On what grounds?
Very simple grounds. I mean, I was Defence Secretary and as well as Foreign Secretary when I was in government, so I accept that there is a need in certain circumstances to use military force. That is something which is sometimes necessary in the international situation. When, for example, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and annexed Kuwait, I believed that there was no way that Kuwait was going to be liberated except by the use of armed force. And on that occasion, of course, the coalition that did so was not just the Western powers, but it included Iraq's neighbours. It included Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Turkey.
But this case you saw as very different.
This was totally different. Although I shared the government's view that Saddam Hussein was a very evil man who would like to act in an aggressive way against his neighbours, and had done so, not just in respect of Kuwait, but also in respect of Iran, my view was that since the first Gulf War, his power had been so emasculated. And that wasn't just my view. That is indeed why, at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, Turkey, although they did not like Saddam Hussein, did not think a war was necessary.
Well, let's talk about what your party, the Conservative Party, up for re-election within the next 12, 14 weeks. There's going to be a general election. If your party takes government, realistically, they wouldn't have done anything different than Tony Blair did. Realistically, the Conservative Party's links with US foreign policy are well known, very strong. You'd have gone to war in Iraq on whatever the basis that was given, wouldn't you?
May I beg slightly to differ, if I may? You are quite right, there were people within my party who strongly supported what Tony Blair did. Ian Duncan Smith, who was the leader of the opposition at the time, and he carried most of the Conservative Party with him. But you know, my main criticism of Tony Blair, and of those who agreed with him, is that they misunderstood the British-American relationship. Yes, Britain and America are very close, but there have been numerous occasions over the last 60 years when the United Kingdom has differed from the United States on very big issues. Roosevelt and Churchill strongly disagreed about Stalin. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan totally disagreed about nuclear weapons and about the American invasion of Grenada, where Thatcher was very, very critical. John Major and Bill Clinton on how to deal with the problems of Bosnia and Yugoslavia. In each case, deep disagreements, but both on the American side and on the British side, there was a realization that the fundamental relationship remained sound. And that's why I think Tony Blair, because of lack of experience and, frankly, a lack of interest in history, made a fundamentally wrong judgment. There was a naivety and innocence. I'd never accused him of deliberately lying or anything of that kind. I think he just misunderstood what was needed to keep the British-American relationship close.
Well, let's just take that forward, going forward a few months, when your party may form a government. What would your leadership have done different then? Are you saying that with a bullish American leader saying we are going into Iraq, we want you to be our second in there, you've got a leader who's strong enough to say no to that?
It frankly depends on who the leader would have been at that time, because individuals differ, just as George W. Bush is different from Barack Obama. So too, it depends on who the Conservative leader at the time would be.
David Cameron, then?
Well, what I'm reasonably certain is that a Conservative government would have been much more cautious. Remember, the whole essence of Tony Blair's position was what has become known as liberal interventionism, that Western countries should use their military power for regime change. Now, that has been a view of which conservative governments have always been very, very suspicious. We clashed, when I was Defense Secretary and Foreign Secretary, we clashed with the United States over that in relation to Bosnia, former Yugoslavia. We said you don't go to war with other countries simply because you disapprove of their internal regime. Only if they are acting aggressively to you or to your allies, and only if you have some sort of international legitimacy.
Which presumably is why you personally see a great difference between the British role in Iraq and the British role in Afghanistan,
oh, yes.
which you say is being won. Al-Qaeda, you say, has been neutralised in Afghanistan.
Well, let me say, you're quite right that I take a very different view of not the British role, the international role in Afghanistan. The intervention of NATO forces in Afghanistan was approved unanimously by the Security Council of the United Nations. And even to this day, the Russian government, the Chinese government, the Indian government, the Pakistani government, the Saudi government, most governments in the world, even the Iranian government, has not been fundamentally hostile to what is happening in Afghanistan, because there's been a recognition throughout the international community that the Taliban regime were not only very primitive in many of their attitudes, but were also giving sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, and that was unacceptable in the international community.
You've accepted in some of your writings on the situation in Afghanistan that it's unlikely the Taliban will be totally neutralised, in which case, what does Britain attain?
My view on Afghanistan is that you cannot, as NATO, expect a purely military solution. There has to be a political solution as well. But that is equally true for the Taliban. There is no way the Taliban themselves can ever hope to reoccupy the whole of Afghanistan and control that state. The Taliban have killed people because of improvised explosive devices on the roadside or suicide bombers, but they have no aircraft, they have no artillery, they have none of the conventional means which you are required to have if you're going to overrun a whole country. And even if NATO withdrew, even if the Americans withdrew ground forces from Afghanistan, I have no doubt in my own mind they would continue, at the invitation of the Afghan government, to provide NATO air power, to give continuing air support to the Afghan government. So the combined effect of that means that Taliban can't win either. So the objective, to answer your question, is to persuade not only ourselves, but also the Taliban that a political solution is required. And part of that political solution may involve, in my view, the Taliban or elements of the Taliban becoming part of the Afghan government. But there has to be an unequivocal, unambiguous commitment, no continuing relationship with Al-Qaeda, no tolerance of international terrorism from within Afghan territory.
You've said in some of your writing, diplomacy with arms is like music without instruments.
I was quoting Frederick the Great, who said that originally. I cannot claim to be the author of that remark.